Hello and welcome. My name is Melissa Galasso, and I am very excited to be here to talk to you about a brand new SAS that has been issued by the AICPA's Auditing Standards Board. Now, this SAS is very targeted. It is specifically related to single audits. However, it also is a very important needed change. The AICPA, as you've been probably noticing, has issued a plethora of standards lately. They've issued standards related to audit evidence, auditing estimates related to change in risk assessment. However, when you do a single audit, right, AUC Section 935 applies, or what we call compliance audits. And in AUC Section 935, what it really focuses on is trying to help people understand how do you take all of the other sections, right? AUC sections 100s, 200s, 300s, all the way through to the 800s and even 900s, and ask yourself, how does this apply when I'm performing a compliance audit? Because obviously AUC section 315 is around the risk and material misstatement. But when you're doing a compliance audit, you're focused on the risk and material non-compliance. And when you're doing reporting, right, you have a single audit report. And so as a result, there are some differences between what you would do in terms and conditions and reporting and risk assessment that just aren't applicable to single audits. And so in the back of AUC section 935, in addition to providing guidance throughout 935 on how do I take the concept of material misstatement and apply it to material non-compliance, it also helps us understand what sections are just not applicable, right? That they're not convertible, they just don't apply, right? So for example, 540 on estimates hasn't applied because it isn't applicable when we're looking at it from the perspective of the auditor there, right? So there's certain things that we're required to do. And so they have this wonderful appendix. However, with the issuance of several of these standards, from starting with basically 142, they didn't really go through and look at that appendix clearly to say, hey, are we doing this correctly? Is there other stuff that needs to be scoped out? Or do the paragraph numbers just need to be updated because we've now rearranged some of these paragraphs? And so as a result, the appendix was out of date. And so that was creating some confusion for those of us who do a lot of work in the single audit area, trying to figure out, well, is this applicable? Is this not applicable? And so they're addressing that through the implementation of SAS 148, which is amendments to AUC section 935. And so again, as we think about why do we have AUC section 935 is to help us do compliance audits. And we use this very often in the single audit world. There are other uses of compliance audits, but governmental audits are probably the most common application of it. And AUC section 935, again, addresses how do you take gas and really fix it in the world of a compliance audit. And so there are a list of standards that are just not relevant and that are in that appendix that need to be updated. In particular, the two standards that had the biggest impact on the appendix is SAS 142, which is on audit evidence. And in that scenario, it was actually not a huge change so much as it was a movement. There were sections of that was in AUC section 500 for audit evidence that was moved to AUC section 501. So therefore, the movement of that created obviously an issue. And so they had to fix that movement. And then we had SAS 145 regarding risk assessment. They decided that SAS 143, which is related to auditing estimates, was not going to have a material impact or needed change in the appendix, or SAS 144, because in these scenarios, they're just not applicable at all. So in their entirety, right, auditing accounting estimates is not applicable to a compliance audit. And so in its entirety, so there's no impact there. And then when we look at SAS 144, it only changes certain application material, and that already wasn't relevant to AUC section 935. So no changes were truly needed as a result of that. So really the focus is on SAS 142 and SAS 145. And there was a lot of nitty gritty paragraph type items. So when you're doing this, you really have to pay close attention to these paragraphs, especially when we're in this sort of guidance where there are some that's been effective and some that's not effective yet. So we have these A's and B's floating around that makes things a little bit more complicated when we're looking at the individual SASs. But things like paragraph 12C, 26 to 30, 33C is not of AUC section 315 is not applicable to a compliance audit. However, again, when they went through SAS 145, those paragraph numbers all had to be changed. And so as a result, they had to go through and include comparable paragraphs from SAS 145 into the not applicable listing as well. Significant risk. This is something that always drove me crazy, right? I would look at work papers and they'd be like, oh, that's a significant risk. I'm like, well, there's no such thing as a significant risk when we are doing a compliance audit. There isn't that requirement there. And then classes of transactions, account balances, and disclosures that are not significant but are material, that was added to the appendix in this sort of runaround. So from history, right, the concept of a significant risk has not been applicable to a compliance audit. I see it all the time. In fact, work paper sometimes require you to document it when it's not applicable. But the concept of a class of transaction, account balance, or disclosure was added, and so it's still not applicable to the compliance audit. So when we look at how we frame some of this, when we're applying 315 in particular, they wanted to make sure that they were clear there. In addition, if you looked at 145, there's significant changes around the 5 components of internal control. They were reordered, they were identified as either primarily direct or primarily indirect, and a huge focus on the control activities component. And so the control activities component obviously does apply to compliance audits. And so they've added some additional documentation around controls over compliance that are required to be tested due to the governmental audit requirement. So inside of 145, there's a list of the controls that are required to be identified and prior to go through the effectiveness, not the effectiveness, but the design and implementation. But in the government world, we're required to take it one step further, and we're required to test the operating effectiveness. We need to plan for low control risk. And so again, they've kind of beefed up how to apply that control activities component within the single audit. And they added an additional requirement related to activities relating to the rise from the use of IT. That was a huge focus of SAS 145, which is the focus on IT-related controls. Obviously, IT-related control is super applicable to a compliance audit. And so again, they've added some additional requirements there as well. In addition, when we look at SAS 145, there were some things that really needed to be included, but they didn't want to do it as an exclusion. They wanted to correct it first. So certain paragraphs, in particular 35 and then 37 through 38, were added as requirements in 935. So they were adapted, made into compliance-friendly verbiage and applicability, and then as a result are included in the appendix as not applicable because the already converted requirements are there. So you don't have to go look at 935 because the guidance is, in 145 because the guidance is in 935. And so they've kind of made it a little bit easier here. So instead of referencing 315 for those, they included what they wanted into the AUC section 945 or 935 so that they could then have that information in there, how they wanted it to be verbiaged for compliance audits, and therefore the original text is not needed because it hasn't been adjusted for compliance audits. And when we look at the language around, and I find this always super confusing, the exit 935 says you didn't have to do financial statement and assertion level guidance because it was very hard. What do you mean by financial statement and assertion level? And so the applicability 935 just excluded it. Now the ASB has said, okay, well, it's not perfect the way it is, but we can adjust it and update it for compliance audits. And so there was a requirement that was added to AUC section 935, but again, updated for compliance audit. So historically, we have not had to do it. It's been made into something that's compliance audit friendly. And then there was also this really crazy inconsistency between 315 and 330. So in AUC section 935, they basically have like the list of all of the sections and then what's not applicable. And when you went to 315, it said significant risks were inapplicable, but in 330, it had the response to the significant risk. Well, since there was no significant risk, technically there was no response needed. But now they've fixed that inconsistency between those sections within the appendix to make them correct that there's just not applicable. And then they've also added the performing substantive procedures for each relevant assertion about each significant class of transactions, account balance, and disclosure has also been added as not applicable. So as you can probably imagine, much cleaner than it has been historically. So in terms of when will this be effective, it will be effective for the 501 section, which again is the movement out of 500 into 501, in line with SAS 142, which was December 15, 2022. And then everything else consistent with the changes in SAS 145 will be December 15, 2023. All right, so that's a wrap on this new SAS. As I said, very exciting for those of us who do a lot of work in this area. The appendix being out of date was really difficult, and so this is going to make it a lot easier for us. So if you guys aren't familiar with it and you perform some single audits, I do recommend taking a quick look. All right, with that, I want to thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope to see you in a future Nano Learning. Have a great day. Bye-bye.